We're picking up with Zach where we left off. Sorry, there was a small interruption, some internet issue. So, Zach, there's this pairing of interest and ignorance, which leads to this kind of misinformation that you say. And you also talk about imposters capturing some piece of the market, or at least hoping to do so. How's that possible in a field like this?
I think it's just it's possible because of just the supply-demand conditions and the fact that the people making the decisions don't know any better, right? So,
yeah.
I think that what the combination of excitement and ignorance speaks to is that you sort of have you have I think this comes up a lot. Is you have the situation where the excitement speaks to demand, and the ignorance speaks to just the fact that most people don't really know anything about it. And at that point, if you're I think maybe the kind of crass way of putting it is in investment communities, people talk about smart money and dumb money or something like that, right? And I think it's very easy when you have something that is sort of perceived as a revolutionary technology to have a lot of dumb money, right? Because if overnight, think about it this way: how many people are experts in machine learning and say, well, the people that have the right combination of they understand the math, they understand the engineering discipline, they have a feeling for the properties of real data. The people that are in that right area of maybe a few thousand people, growing really fast, but a few thousand people historically, at least as of 5 years ago, who, are sort of advanced machine learning, scholars who kind of have a feeling for the state of the art in the field.
Correct. No, you're right.
So then overnight, right? So overnight, suddenly there's billions of dollars of interest in investing in this area. And it's where are the startups? Where are the million? There's enough money going around to fund 10,000 startups, but there's 3,000 talented people. So then it's where does the, maybe I'm being a bit of elitist, or, the numbers aren't exactly right, but you get the idea. It's first of all, where are the investors getting their information? How do they know who knows what they're talking about and who doesn't?
Okay, so about a couple of weeks ago, we spoke to Avi Goldfarb and Eric Brynjolfsson. One's at MIT and the other's at in Toronto. So basically,
right.
what the case they're making from the economist side is that the interest that you talk about, the extraordinary interest, is because the cost of prediction has fallen. And when the cost of prediction falls, it's not about whether you're an expert or not, but it becomes cheaper to predict next steps. And therefore, it's transformational for businesses, and therefore the interest, and therefore the money.
Well, let's just make things concrete. Predicting what precisely?
Yeah, for each business, it's different, right?
So what do you mean by the cost of prediction? Are you talking about prediction in the machine learning sense, the cost of?
Yeah.
I guess I need to understand precisely what are the parameters of this claim. What precisely are they claiming? The price of predicting, Eric Brynjolfsson, I don't know him personally, but he bills himself as something of a futurist. So I don't know, he's talking about his ability to forecast the future, or is he talking about the ability of a machine learning system to, say, draw an inference, which are very different?
Yeah, based on what you called function fitting right in the beginning. So I'll come back to your
the cost, the marginal cost of making a prediction is always close to zero, right? The real challenge is saying well, how good a model can you make?
Correct.
In the past, it's not that you can make extremely accurate inferences, but they were really expensive unless maybe you draw upon a human. It's that we just truly lack the technology, and now we have it. But I think that story that they're telling, these economists, I think economists like to draw simple models, and they like to tell simple stories, and it's very easy, to see this. You see this in field after field. It's very easy to draw a simplistic model that will tell the story that you want to tell. You just have to commit to your narrative first. And I think that there is maybe a lot missing from that story, that there's a whole bunch of actual genuine excitement, and there's a lot of people using this technology in effective ways within businesses, and there actually has been since like 1999, right? Basically, for a long time, the biggest things that started were search engines, and which were, you know, a $1 trillion application of graph mining algorithms, and the web ads that powered Google. But, you know, you also have all these people that are talking, you know, investing in vaporware, and you have people receiving investments who have no expertise in machine learning whatsoever that are making claims that might never pan out. In fact, a lot of the startups for a long time that were like the success stories of AI, it's very hard to find a successful AI startup story that actually like turned into a sustainable business. The more common narrative has then gotten acquired by some large company. And so there's been a huge number of these acquisitions for talent, or in America we call them, like, I don't know how they're broadly known, but we call them, at least like in Silicon Valley, acqui-hires. And so there's been a lot of acqui-hires, including for teams that didn't actually have any talent, but just by, you know, investors that know they need an AI story, or they need an AI splash. But, you know, I mean, I'd have to understand what Eric and Abby's arguments are a little bit better to comment on them intelligently. But it sounds like there may be there's a bit maybe being a bit charitable.
Okay. Yeah. So you identify 3 common avenues of language misuse. I'm really interested in this. Suggestive definitions, overloaded terminology, and suitcase words.
Sure.
I'd like you to go over this, because this is there's a lot of this out there, right?
Sure. Yeah. So I think what you're referring to is I wrote together with a colleague, or I guess we call everyone who works in the same field our colleague, but I guess we wrote a paper together, so he's a colleague. Jacob Steinhardt, who is now starting as a professor at UC Berkeley and just finished his PhD at Stanford. We, for the International Conference on Machine Learning, we wrote this position paper about troubling trends in machine learning scholarship. You know, the idea being we don't just have problems with the media and problems with, you know, maybe investors and stuff who are misguided. We also have some weaknesses inside the academic community itself, and we try to address some things that we see as bad patterns that are cropping up in machine learning papers that we would rather try to, you know, reduce. So you're referring to in particular is, you know, we focused on a few different things, like weakness in sort of experimental practice, like the way people will propose really complicated models and then say they do a little bit better, but not actually do the part of science that is the science, falsifiability, which is general parts of their proposed algorithm are necessary or not necessary, or, you know, work versus don't work, but just saying sort of make a very complicated system and then say we beat people a little bit. The part that you're focusing on is not the experimental practice or the use of mathematics, but the use of language. And here, I mean, I'm a bit anal about language, so this is I have lots of peeves about the way people sometimes write papers. The things we focused on, so the suggestive definitions, this is basically, I think why people, just like investors get a bit too excited and do ridiculous things, people in the community, in the academic community, get a bit excited. And one of the things that they do, and I think this is partly governed by their incentives from the outside, that they're sort of positioning for a catchy paper, is one way that you sort of make a claim that can slip past peer reviewers is, rather than making it in the form of a statement about what your model can or can't do, what you do is you actually give a sort of misleading name for what you're doing. So instead of saying we are trying to do a passage-based question answering, you say we're doing reading comprehension, which suggests that the machine is actually understanding what it's doing. Or instead of saying we're doing slot filling, which is a standard dialogue systems thing, we now call it natural language understanding. There's a number of these things where people use words like consciousness or thought or mind or curiosity or, you know, and a lot of us are guilty of this in some form or another, that we come up with some technique, we come up with some algorithm, we want to give it a cool name. The danger, I think, is that basically what you do is you sneak in a very bold claim, you sneak in a very strong connotation without actually having to argue for it. You know, if you say my model works like the human mind, people say it does, prove it. But if you say we call this model, you know, the consciousness model or something like this, then we call this, you know, we call these thought vectors or something like that. Well, that's just a name. You know, it's like I've just chosen this arbitrary name. So that's something that we don't like. You mentioned the other thing, suitcase words. Suitcase words, this is actually a term that was coined, to my knowledge, I think it was coined by Marvin Minsky, although maybe there's some antecedent even before him. So this is, you know, decades ago. But basically, these are words that they're so overloaded with, they mean so many different things to so many different people that when you actually try to unpack these words, you sort of, you know, have no idea what's going to fall out. And it becomes very hard to make an argument in terms of these terms because they mean different things to everyone. So the only way that you can sort of address these concepts is to try to chop them up into pieces. So I'll give you an example, is if you talk about, well, fairness. Many people have many different ideas about what's fair. They're not necessarily ones that are going to agree with your very specific technical definition. Interpretability is one. No one's quite sure what they mean. So people use the word interpretability. I mean, the real danger, right, is when you use the word as though it has a technical meaning or a specific meaning in a scientific paper. You know, if you're writing poetry, then it can be useful that a word has 5 different meanings. This might actually give you a kind of interesting sort of pivot that speaks to some kind of, you know, thing about how we process language. But in a scientific paper, it's not a good thing if a word has 10 meanings. This is horrible. You want to be as precise as possible. And so if you start making arguments that are ambiguous, or where any person who reads it can come away with their own idea with what you mean, then this isn't really good scientific communication. And I think this happens with a lot of these, you know, okay, interpretability, fairness, when people start talking about the mind, people start talking about intelligence, people talk about, you know, any of these different things. That could happen. The other danger, I think, and this kind of speaks to just the fact there's so much excitement about AI, and I want to emphasize it's overall a great thing. Like, we're overall excited to have people coming into the field. We don't want to discourage newcomers. But one of the dangers is everyone's trying to get in. Everyone, now the standards for getting into PhD are so high. Everyone feels like you have to have a paper before you even start PhD. And which is, you know, it's great that people are trying, but what ends up happening is people adopt this mindset of just going, you know, as fast as possible, submitting things that are not necessarily proofread, or not necessarily combed over for quality, are not necessarily reviewed by someone who, you know, is has some kind of better judgment or senior person in the field, and it overwhelms the reviewers. And you start getting papers published where people start using technical terms in the wrong way. And the danger here is that if a paper actually has a really interesting contribution or a very successful experiment, it gets published even though it uses all the technical terms in the wrong way to mean the wrong things. And then suddenly, you then don't know when you're reading a paper. For example, there's this term deconvolution. So deconvolution has a mathematical meaning. It's like very precise. It means to like reverse a convolution, like an inverse convolution. But when you see this word now in a deep learning paper, I don't know if they mean deconvolution in the real mathematical meaning, or in the meaning of just going from a low dimension to a high dimension, which is now how it's used in new papers, because some people got confused at some point about like 3 years ago. And now people have to say these like weird things where you have to now say deconvolution and then put a big set of parentheses, and you have to specify which of the meanings you mean, because, you know, the words become sort of soupy. So I think clear scientific communication is really important. I think it's important for us as researchers to acknowledge the role that we play in the, you know, I guess the hype cycle isn't maybe the whole story, but it's part of it, right? That in rushing to sort of get our share and in trying to sort of profit in the short term off of the excitement about AI, there's a danger that we are participating in a chain of sort of misinformation that snowballs all the way from the papers to the corporate press blogs to the media, ultimately. And I think there's a danger that in the course of just, you know, like our main point in that paper, and sorry to sorry to ramble on, but I think our main point in the paper is that like writing a scientific paper, ideally for us, should be like a generous act. You know, it's not ultimately about like I got it in, but hopefully it should, you know, like, or like I got to add one paper to my Google Scholar page. Hopefully, you know, it's about like, I think I have something that is ready and is mature, and like I am going to benefit other people by sharing this. And I think when we get away from this mindset, you know, the excitement and the easy money gets people sometimes thinking a little bit too much from a different perspective, which is like, you know, I want part of the action versus like I have something to share.
You know, I get the drift, Zach. You also say that you feel like you're a pebble in a stream. I read that somewhere. So what's the fix? Now, for the research community, you've explained it. What's the fix for the outside?
We need more adults, right? So the sense in which I said I'm like a pebble in the stream is that, okay, if I write a typical blog post, you know, maybe several thousand people read it. Maybe if it winds up on like the front page of Hacker News for a day or something, maybe 50,000 people read it. In the scope of like the amount of people that are ingesting news about artificial intelligence and machine learning and kind of the sort of overall state of the discourse, at this point it involves tens or hundreds of millions of people. And I don't have the ability to, you know, I can maybe influence journalists a little bit who might influence other people, but I don't really have the ability to like single-handedly shape the discourse. I think ultimately, you know, journalists need to, I mean, sort of everyone across the board needs to sort of, I think, just think responsibly. For one, journalists need to think like journalists. And I think that sounds like patronizing or something, but or maybe even like a tautology. But what I mean by that actually is that scientific journalism actually traditionally is very different from some other kinds of journalism, because you generally say like, as a writer for say the Science Times or something, your job isn't to be the arbiter of what is good science. Historically, you say that's the job of peer review. Your job is to find things that have passed the bar of peer review at a journal, and then decide which ones, maybe if I were to dumb them down a little bit, are good, you know, might be of interest to the general public, right? That's very different from how you cover the economy or politics. There, you sort of you assume that everyone is lying to you, and you try to get to the bottom of the story. And if you're not the expert on an obscure area of like trade theory or something like that, like you find someone who is an expert and you sort of act as a conduit and you synthesize this information. You go out, you gather the conflicting perspectives. You say, someone makes a claim, I don't believe them until I verified it. If I'm not the authority, I'm gonna find who the authority is and get some opinions. I'm gonna find out, is this a controversial claim? Is this not a controversial claim? You don't just take people's like press and publish it as news. But what's happening now with AI is that like the technology is in this weird stage where people are hawking stories directly to the press. So the corporations will, you know, if they have an internal research lab, on one hand, it's great that they're funding research at companies. I've worked in corporate research labs and I hope they continue to, and it's a great opportunity for researchers. On the other hand, they're hoping to get some great PR out of it, and they're sending press releases either in the form of just posting to their blog, which then gets picked up and retweeted by and paraphrased and reposted on every single news site as though it's news without any kind of opposing opinions. This is work that hasn't passed peer review. This is work that is specifically angled with a sort of profit agenda, right? Of, you know, it's not just about like, you know, we have a paper that we published in Nature or something. This is people trying to say, establish themselves as authorities, and you know, there's a sort of angling and self-interest there. And I think, you know, the high-level thing is, from the journalist perspective at least, is that people need to regard this more like traditional forms of journalism and less like the sort of translational variety of science journalism. I think journalists need to actually say that your job is to synthesize and job is to hold people accountable. Same for, I think also, you know, part of the thing is people need to distinguish between science and opinions and prophecy. And these things get talked about. You know, technology like stirs people's imaginations, and that's great. And I love for people to have imaginations. But that's not, your job as a policymaker or as someone running a think tank or as a journalist. It's not to forget about the distinction between these things. So you can't write articles and you can't, convene a special session of Congress because some, philosopher decided that in the year 2300, the robots are going to march on Washington. We need to have a distinction between this sort of like insane science fiction and like a real discourse about technology that actually exists. So I think, we need grown-ups in politics, we need grown-ups in journalists, and ultimately in the research community itself, I think we need to also grow up a little bit too. And
Zach, you've given us a lot of your time, thanks. But one last question very quickly. When should you not call it AI? I mean, see, now AI and ML are being used interchangeably often in headlines. So give us an idea, give us an example.
There's sort of a category error of comparing the two in a way, and that AI is this very broad aspirational term. I think that the best definition that I like came from our dean of computer science at Carnegie Mellon, Andrew Moore. He said something like, artificial intelligence is the science and engineering of building computer systems that behave in ways that until recently we believed required human intelligence. I probably slightly messed that up, but the quote was something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's this very broad aspirational term. It doesn't, like AI broadly in that sense, it speaks to a moving target, it speaks to an aspiration. It doesn't actually speak to a specific technology necessarily. And that's why you can have a community that called itself AI community that was doing one thing and investigating one set of tools 10 years ago and is doing some very different things today and will do some very different things 20 years from now. So I think the reason why I think it's better to call it machine learning is that it's worth pointing out that, well, if you're talking about the technology, then it's an awful lot more specific. And you communicate, more information by being, if you can use the same amount of words and be much more specific, that's generally a good idea. It's generally more informative. So, I think, it's not so much that the words artificial intelligence are so horrible per se. I think, you could argue, I think there are many reasonable people who would argue that actually we shouldn't have abandoned those words in the first place and those were a reasonable term. But I think the challenge is, you should always ask yourself, why are you using the words you're using? Why are we using the language we're using? And I think the dangerous thing now is that I know the reason why people are saying AI, and I know the reason why people are saying their startup is AGI, and it's that, it's this feeling of like that the way you're going to convey forward progress, the way you're going to get people excited is by changing what you call it. And this is the really dangerous part, I think. It's that people are not making the decision. It's the intent. It's why are you using the word you're using? And I think the reason ultimately, you talk to people, you say now every AI startup is a .ai. They're not .ml. There was a period where you had .mls that lasted for like 2 or 3 years. Now everything is .ai. But if you talk to people, there are plenty of people you'll talk to. They'll say point blank, like the venture capitalists are more excited about .ai. You make your company .ai, you instantly become worth, $2 million more than if it were .ml. And this kind of like mindless use of language, like this is the danger. And I think that's when you need to ask yourself, like, am I saying this without even thinking about what my words mean? Yeah. And at that point, when all you're doing is just chasing career cookies and you don't care at all about whether, why you're saying what you're saying, at that point, I think that's when you have a kind of mindset that it's going to result in just, a whole lot of disappointment and a whole lot of kind of irresponsible ventures.
Yeah, I get that. Thanks so much, Zach. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, no problem. Great talking to you.
Yeah, bye.
Cheers.
Cheers.